Okay, well, it's 12:05. Hello and welcome. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director at UCCS. And once again, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here. This is the last talk of our summer season. And next quarter, we take up a new annual theme, which has been vetted with the UCCS Advisory Board, some of our legislative contacts and others. The new theme is Emerging from the Pandemic, Promoting Health and Prosperity for All Californians in the Wake of COVID-19. Now, some of you might say, well, that's out of date already. The Delta variant, concerns about spread and rising caseloads, but regardless of the state of viral transmission, we do need to find ways to cope from the standpoint of public health as well as the economy, and we'll be featuring a number of speakers who will address these topics. So before looking forward to issues of emergence as 2021 and 2022 unfold, we're taking the opportunity today to look back. Plagues aren't new in the world, and history might have something to teach us. Therefore, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Valor Arthy. Professor Arthy is an assistant professor in economics at UC Irvine and also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. As you can read on the flyer available on our website, uccs.ucdavis.edu, her work centers in part on economic history. Among many other projects, she and her colleagues have assembled 155 years of data on local economic activity in the United States. Tip O'Neill famously quipped that all politics is local. Perhaps all economics is local as well. So analysis of this data set could lead to a better understanding of local dynamics in the development of the American economy and the long run effects of local economic conditions on the well-being of specific groups. Professor Arthy holds a BA from USC and a PhD in economic and social history from the University of Oxford. She holds several grants, including a recent one from the National Science Foundation. And in her young career, she's already won several awards. So it really is a great pleasure to welcome here today, Professor Valor Arthy. Remember, for questions at the end, please raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand feature, and our staff will call on you. And without further ado, let's turn it over to Professor Valor Arthy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to UCCS for having me and to all of you for being here to hear about this topic. I'm really pleased to be here. So this work that I'll be presenting today is based in part on a recent paper that a colleague of mine, John Parman, and I wrote, looking at kind of what historical crises, both pandemics and recessions, can tell us in terms of what we might anticipate in terms of long-run consequences for health and human capital and labor outcomes of COVID-19, since we're still sort of in the midst of it. So, at least until, the most recent spike, there was a sense that, vaccines are starting to roll out, mortality and case rates are starting to get somewhat under control. And it was very easy to feel sort of complacent, and it's understandable, of course, we're kind of exhausted and it's a relief that things were starting to improve. But there's a sense in which we might believe, well, maybe the worst effects or the kind of bulk of effects are behind us. But historical evidence would seem to suggest that it may not actually be the case, that there may be kind of a number of potential consequences that we've really yet to see unfold. Very understandably, much of the kind of discussion to date around COVID-19 has focused on the most frightening, the most salient, and the most consequential immediate costs of the crisis, in particular, mortality and job losses. However, there are a number of other outcomes of the pandemic which are already kind of taking hold, which may be less visible, maybe less immediately urgent seeming, but which nevertheless merit our urgent attention. And in particular, I'm talking about potential long-run damage to human capital and well-being. So why should we worry about these outcomes when there are other outcomes that we might worry about, like mortality and vaccination, things like that? And why should we worry about them now when there are so many other urgent things to care about? Well, I would say there's three main reasons for this. Firstly, the adverse effects, have already sort of taken hold to some extent. The seeds for these adverse effects have been planted. So we're not kind of in an avoiding adverse effects scenario right now. We're already kind of having to contend with things that may become a problem down the line. Secondly, human capital and health and labor more generally are hugely consequential, both for people and for society as a whole. And so damage to these outcomes could end up being tremendously costly, both for affected individuals and their families, and for all of us as a society and as an economy. And then finally, one reason why we should worry about these particular outcomes and why we should worry about them now is that damage to these outcomes is typically much easier and much more cost effective to remediate. The sooner in time any kind of positive intervention comes, relative to when the kind of adverse event took place. So, it's much easier and much less costly for us to deal with some of these issues now as they're nascent, rather than before, they've become really difficult and entrenched issues. So you might be asking me, why might COVID-19 cause long-term harm? There's a few reasons for this. The first of them is key features of COVID-19's epidemiology, among them the fact that it has reached a really large group of people across the globe. It's relatively highly transmissible. It's relatively less lethal than some other historical disease outbreaks, and it has many kind of complications or extended features that make it quite harmful from a morbidity perspective. And all of these issues together basically mean that we have a large group of people who have survived infection. Right, so we have kind of a large pool of people who might be facing these long-term consequences and after effects. And to give you a sense of this, and how COVID-19 compares in some of its key epidemiological parameters to other past historical disease outbreaks, we have here a graph that gives you a sense on the x-axis of the transmissibility of COVID-19. And I will say that in this presentation, everything that I'm discussing kind of refers to the initial strain of SARS-CoV-2, not kind of any of the variants. So, here we have a sense of how transmissible COVID-19 is compared to other historical outbreaks. And then on the y-axis, we have a sense of how lethal it is, the case fatality rate. And there's kind of two key takeaways that I want you to get from this graph. The first is that, as we can see, COVID-19 is moderately to highly transmissible, and it looks a lot like the level of transmissibility of a number of historical pandemics, including the 1918 influenza pandemic. And then the second thing that I want you to consider is that it is much less lethal than many other historical pandemics that we've seen. So it is both, very easy to spread and not that lethal, comparatively speaking, which means ultimately that a lot of people are going to get sick, but then ultimately survive and potentially have to contend with the consequences of this earlier illness. Secondly, we might expect COVID-19 to have these aftershocks because the pandemic has also sparked this unprecedentedly large economic downturn, which in its own right, apart from this disease outbreak element, has the capacity to permanently scar and shape trajectories of health and income, even for those who may not fall ill themselves. And this is actually a feature of COVID-19 that is, relatively unique compared to other past pandemics, because we've rarely had it be the case that you have kind of a substantial disease outbreak that, not only comes alongside, but actually precipitates a really substantial recession as well. And you can see this, in this graph that compares, various historical disease outbreaks in the US over the last 200 or so years, and looks at the kind of concurrent impact on GDP per capita. And so what we can see here is that the kind of recession associated with COVID-19 is much larger than most of what we see in the wake of any other disease outbreak. So this is the Great Depression, of course. And so you can see that, it's perhaps not as large as the Great Depression, but certainly the downturns that we see following most historical pandemics is not nearly this large. And that makes it a uniquely challenging issue because we are going to see these health channel effects and these economy channel effects And we're not really going to have a perfect analog that combines the two. So we're going to end up having to look at both historical pandemics and historical recessions to try to understand how COVID-19 might impact people through both these channels. Finally, we might expect COVID-19 to have these long-run adverse consequences because a wealth of theory and evidence on human capital formation drawn from kind of work at the intersection of economics and medicine and public health suggests that shocks to health or to income tend to interact with each other. And moreover, they tend to compound over time. So kind of ill health begets ill health, good health begets good health, high incomes beget high incomes, and so on and so forth. And so to give you a sort of sense of what this might look like in the case of COVID-19, I've borrowed this figure from Briggs and Bassel. And what this shows basically is kind of how our quality of life or general health status may deteriorate with age. And so we're going to be kind of thinking about our kind of lifetime profile of quality of life is declining naturally with age as we, have increasing health problems, meaning that this kind of quarter circle region is going to represent our kind of cumulative quality of life over our lifetime. And so what you can imagine is that if an individual, contracts COVID-19 and becomes ill, there's an immediate kind of one-time reduction in their health status or quality of life. Right. And then let's say, in one scenario that the person, gets better relatively quickly. So they have this, plunge in their quality of life, but they rebound relatively quickly and they rebound to their full initial health status and they continue that kind of trajectory for the rest of their lifetime. Even so, that person is missing out on this kind of little wedge of quality of life from having been ill in the short term. Right. So that's bad, but it doesn't seem that bad compared to imagine if somebody, gets sick, but then experiences long COVID. So they have kind of a prolonged set of COVID-19 symptoms. They're not getting better in the usual 2 to 3 weeks that we might expect. And so they maybe are, kind of sick for longer, in the hospital for longer. And then they may have persistent fatigue or kind of brain fogginess or respiratory difficulties that cause them to experience a lower quality of life. And they never really, recover to their initial health trajectory. And so, over their lifetime, their kind of health trajectory looks like this, such that what they're losing out ultimately over their lifetime is this region of quality of life, right? And then you can imagine a much worse outcome, which is perhaps the person, becomes ill, experiences a really severe case of COVID-19. They survive very luckily, but they require hospitalization. Maybe they have a stroke in the aftermath of COVID-19 as a result of this, and they require lifelong care. Maybe this limits their ability to work. And so their quality of life and their income is suffering over the entire course of their rest of their life. Right. And perhaps it even causes premature death, which means that this entire region of quality of life is lost to them. So you can imagine that even as a relatively young person, and even as a person who very fortunately survives, there's really a large, part of your life where you might continue to see kind of a diminution in your overall general health status and quality of life. And in fact, Briggs and Bassel estimate that up to 30% of the health burden from COVID-19 could in fact be due to pandemic-induced disability rather than to death, despite the fact that so much of our attention up to this point has been on, COVID-19 mortality. In fact, summarizing some recent studies, they show that COVID-19's kind of immediate health penalties are already substantial. So kind of forget about potential latent effect, or things that haven't yet really come to pass, but just thinking about the morbidity consequences that we see today already, they estimate that a number of the global population has comorbidities, so 2 or more conditions, many of them non-communicable, like obesity or diabetes, that substantially raise the risk of death or disability from COVID-19. So people already have kind of underlying conditions that are causing them to have worse experiences of COVID, and their experiences of COVID are in turn worsening these other pre-existing conditions that they had. They also show that a large proportion of the population, both hospitalized and non-hospitalized, have these sequelae, which are kind of other new conditions that result in the aftermath of an infection of COVID-19. So for instance, this would be things like, some of the things that we've been hearing about with respiratory difficulty, or, cognitive, neurological effects, things like that. And then finally, they're showing that a lot of people actually do have symptoms of long COVID, which is, they define as having symptoms for about 3 months after a positive test. So people who are kind of taking quite a long time to recover to their original, health capacity. And I want to emphasize that these estimates do not yet account for potentially latent health issues, so things that don't appear to be health conditions just yet, including those that might exist, if any, in asymptomatic people. We actually really poorly understand what kinds of effects they may be experiencing, of course, because it's hard to measure who these people are in the absence of really widespread testing. These estimates also don't really account for the way that the COVID-19 recession may have impacted health and human capital. So this is all kind of pertaining to the health consequences of having been infected, not the health consequences of perhaps having lost your job, or certainly the intersection of both of those things together. And they're not really yet accounting for those compounding or potentially cross-pollinating effects between health and income, or between two different health conditions that you might have over time. And to give you a sense of kind of what that might look like, here I have just like a really simple schematic that explains at the individual level just some potential mechanisms by which we might expect these compounding and cross-pollinating effects of the pandemic. So we can imagine the pandemic as having fundamentally kind of two main channels, one of which is a health channel related to, are you infected? And one of which is a recession channel. So, are you subject to the adverse economic conditions that have been associated with the pandemic? And of course, you could be exposed to both of these channels directly, right? But I want to emphasize here that kind of having adverse experiences in either one of these channels makes you much likelier to have continued or potentially even worsening adverse consequences, both in that channel and in the other channels through these cross-pollinations. So, let's perhaps walk through an example here. So let's say that the pandemic, causes you to become infected with COVID-19, and, maybe you have to be hospitalized, maybe you don't, but you have some kind of penalty to your health. And perhaps this penalty to your health causes you to be absent from work, or it reduces your stamina and endurance at work, particularly if you're in a manual labor occupation, so you have diminished work capacity. Okay, so let's consider how this, period 1 shock to your health might affect your period 2 health. So, through those channels that we discussed on the previous slides, these comorbidities, sequelae, ongoing effects of COVID-19, and certainly this notion that the lower your initial health stocks are, the lower they will be in the next period, or the worse it will get in the next period. That's going to lead your health outcomes to be at least persistently poor, or potentially even worse than they were in the initial period, just as a matter of course. Okay. And likewise, we can think about what the effects might be through the recession, even if you've never been infected by COVID-19. So, perhaps you lost your job, or you saw your hours cut during the recession, and you've lost your income to some extent. So what this might result in is poor access to healthcare. You're less able to afford high quality and safe housing, and so on and so forth. All these kind of inputs to both health and your economic success are potentially adversely impacted. So what happens as we move into the future, having experienced, let's say, this job loss? So if you've experienced job loss, perhaps you're unemployed for some period of time, and that makes it more difficult to find a job in the second period, right? We know from a wide range of literature that the longer you've been unemployed, typically the harder it is to find that next job. And this could be because employers, whether rightly or wrongly, believe that it's a bad signal. There must be something wrong with you if you've been unemployed for so long. Or in very real terms, it might be that your skills have depreciated over time. So you've gotten kind of rusty on certain key skills that the market demands. It could be that, if you've been unemployed in the initial period, you're willing to accept even jobs that are not a good match for your skills and training, are not a good match for your overall career interests. And so you end up in a worse job, or a job that's worse for you. And it could be that, for instance, because you've been unemployed for a while, you're willing to accept a job even at a lower wage than you previously had or than that you would normally consider. So there's all these reasons why your kind of economic outcomes might get worse the longer you've been employed, simply because you had this initial adverse shock. So those are just kind of explaining these like compounding effects over time through each of these channels. But you can also see that there's these like feedback loops that are occurring between health and income, and also across periods. So just to give you kind of an example, that absenteeism from work, your diminished work capacity, and so on might actually affect your income, right? So if you're absent from work, or if you're less productive at work, you may, suffer a loss of income, or you may get fired or something like that, right? Likewise, when in the first period you lose your income, you lose, the ability to access these inputs that are really important to promoting your health, and that might in turn make you more vulnerable to COVID-19 or other infections, right? And just likewise, the kind of loss of income in the one period might make it harder for you to invest in your health, such that you're more vulnerable to disability later on in life, or to other sorts of outcomes. Just likewise, if you've been if you had this adverse hit on your health in the first period, you might see that kind of working into work limiting disability or chronic illness that ultimately kind of affects your economic outcomes in the second period. Of course, another thing that's really quite interesting and unfortunate here is because of complementarities between health and schooling, having a kind of adverse health event tends to make the time that you spent in school or training less productive. And so that might result in, you being able to get less out of school. It might result in you actually being less incentivized to invest in education and other human capital inputs that are going to ultimately affect your kind of labor market competitiveness. And so from this picture, I just really want you guys to take away this idea that this is all kind of a dynamic system that is kind of compounding over time and kind of cross-pollinating between outcomes. And of course, this is really just speaking of what's happening to individuals, but you can imagine these adverse outcomes spilling over into the family and so on. So on top of the kind of poor quality of life and sense of physical and mental well-being that you might experience, whether you experience, adverse effects through one or the other channel or both, to the extent that people are adversely affected in terms of health or economic status, there's the possibility of intergenerational transmission of that ill health or low socioeconomic status, right? So if I lose my job and I lose my income, perhaps I'm less able to help pay for the schooling of my child, or I'm less able to make sure that they get good preventive care, in terms of their access to hospitals and the medical system. In turn, what we're going to see over time, potentially, is that we're going to have a huge loss. So like, not only is it bad that people's quality of life is poorer, but this reduction in health status and the reduction in kind of economic well-being means that there's a lot of people who could be really happy and productive contributors to our society and to our economy who are not able to make those contributions, right? And so we could potentially see reductions in economic output and in productivity and innovation, that in turn also kind of reduce our tax revenues. And what's sort of sad about that is that those groups who find themselves, in poor health or economic status are very likely to kind of need more support from social safety net and kind of public programs. And so to see kind of a reduction in our output and in our revenues at precisely the moment where there's a large demand on these safety net systems is a really unfortunate place to be. And so this is why I kind of want to emphasize why we should take a long view. Okay, so what evidence do we actually have on the potential long run effects? So the facts that I've just talked about suggest that we might expect the greatest harm only in the long run, with widespread generational scarring arising from these short run morbidity and economic disruptions, not necessarily from the deaths, right? So because we have a large pool of people who've been affected either through the recession or by surviving an infection or both, there's a lot of people with the potential to have these sorts of knock-on effects, okay? As I mentioned, there's not really one clear and close analog that combines both of these features, the economic features and the health features. And of course, if we look to very recent pandemics, like for instance, like, the Ebola crisis, something like that, we don't really have a long enough time scale to look at people over their entire careers and life course, and certainly not intergenerationally. And so history offers a solution to this if we want to kind of look at events that were very similar in many respects to COVID-19, but which have had time for those crises to complete and for us to kind of see what kind of fallout they had. And so what we're going to do in the rest of the presentation is to look at a couple close historical analogs for some help in informing our view of what the long run human impact of COVID-19 might look like, based on the kind of long run experiences that we have actually seen and observed directly there. And so for the health channel, we're going to focus on evidence primarily from the 1918 influenza pandemic. And for the economic channel, we'll focus on evidence primarily from the Great Depression. So just a kind of a brief summary for those of you who may not be so familiar with the specifics of the 1918 influenza pandemic. It parallels COVID-19 in several ways, particularly as we saw in that graph of the case fatality rates and basic reproduction rates. So its rates of transmission, its extensive global spread, and the crude mortality rates are, of a similar order of magnitude. And so we think that at least in its health dimension, the influenza pandemic from 1918 is a reasonable comparator for COVID-19 in its health dimension. So the 1918 pandemic was one of the most acute and widespread natural disasters in modern history, with about a third of the global population infected and symptomatic. Case fatality rates were substantially higher than kind of previous influenza epidemics that the world had experienced. And estimates vary, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million individuals across the world died. The timing and spacing of the pandemic was kind of unprecedented at the time. So it was a really sharp pandemic beginning in approximately spring of 1918 and lasting just a little over 12 months. What I really want to emphasize is that it had a really distinctive mortality and morbidity profile. So whereas kind of most previous strains of influenza had a traditional kind of U-shaped pattern of morbidity and mortality, wherein either very young or very old people were most vulnerable to the disease. In the 1918 pandemic, what was kind of unique was that there was a large group of people in kind of what we would call the prime childbearing or prime working ages roughly 20 to 40, who also were very vulnerable to the disease. And it's precisely that sort of pattern that's going to give rise to this large potential for scarring. And it's a group of people who are otherwise healthy and are relatively resilient, but who are nevertheless susceptible to this disease and who may survive and whose outcomes we're going to want to track over time. So what were some of the short run things that we saw in the 1918 pandemic? So it became very clear very early on that baseline health status mattered to how severe an experience of the pandemic you were going to have. So the pandemic flu mortality was much higher in locations that had higher pre-existing levels of illness or ill health. So places that had higher rates of pneumonia, higher rates of infant mortality, or larger shares of air pollution. They were also going to be kind of much higher in places where population density was higher or were concerns related to population density, for instance, like overcrowded housing or poor housing quality, or very heterogeneous populations were. So pandemics came to cities earlier and which were much worse there, something that was linked to residential overcrowding and poor quality housing. Likewise, factors that affected whether people were able to easily adopt public health recommendations mattered above and beyond their association with poverty. So for instance, places where there was a higher share of illiterate people in the population or higher share of foreign-born people tended to have higher pandemic mortality, even above and beyond controlling for poverty or income. But what was really important is that there were further spillovers to native-born people as well. So for instance, if you were a native-born neighbor of a foreign-born person, or if you were living in an area with many foreign-born or many illiterate people, you were also much likelier to get sick than if you were living among more literate or a more native-born heavy population, which just emphasizes, I think, how important it is for us to care about what's happening all over the world and in our localities, it's not just our own individual behavior or susceptibilities that matters. We really have an impact on each other. Considering these mechanisms I've talked about, illiteracy, foreign-born status, residential overcrowding, bad baseline health, it's very easy to see the hand of income in this, right? And that is something that I want to emphasize is that, income was tremendously important to how bad of a pandemic you were going to have in 1918. So people and places with higher baseline health status and higher baseline living standards found it much easier to resist infection and much easier to deal with infection if it took place. And people in places where those conditions were worse had a much more severe experience in the pandemic. And I think that's something that will probably be familiar to many of us from the narratives of COVID-19. In terms of demographic effects, we saw reductions in the sex ratio, which means a kind of reduction in the number of males, share of males in the population. This was due to a number of different reasons that varied over the different empirical contexts that we're looking at. But the key thing to keep in mind is that it's changing the sex composition of the population to some degree. We also saw kind of changes in marital and fertility behavior. So largely because of fear and uncertainty over the disease, the need to social distance, and in some cases, the ways that marriage laws were implemented in the past, what we saw actually was a large drop in fertility during the pandemic. In some cases, there was a small rebound afterwards when people who had kind of held off getting pregnant during the pandemic, went ahead and had the children that they would have liked to have previously had. But in some cases, this was actually a permanent reduction. So those were just kind of, missing children. So children who would have been normally born, but never were. And this is, because of this disruption to marriage and labor markets. And so what I kind of want us to take away from this is that, the pandemic can also have effects on kind of individual and, social well-being more generally in the way that the pandemic influences demography. So to the extent that it changes, the sex composition or the age composition of the population, or even the average health status of cohorts. So for instance, in Sweden, a lot of that fertility reduction was selective. So higher income mothers continued to have children while lower income mothers sat the pandemic out. That means that on average, the kids that are born are going to be richer and with better health, right? And that's going to kind of affect, all kinds of things as well. And so to the extent that those demographic changes happen in response to the pandemic, we might end up seeing long-lived effects on economic development, population health, and individual well-being as those cohorts age and become kind of prime age earners and taxpayers and employers, employees, landlords, tenants, and so on. What about the long-run effects? So the kind of lethality and particular age profile of the 1918 strain, gave rise to these long-run effects, and we might expect to see similar things of COVID-19 since most people who become ill ultimately do survive. And in some parts of the US, about a third of all childbearing age women fell ill, which means that there's a huge scope for these adverse shocks in utero through maternal morbidity to ultimately impact, early childhood development of those children and potentially give them some long-run costs. And there's actually a really large literature on this in economics and in public health that studies, the impact of fetal exposure to the 1918 pandemic. So, did your mother become ill with the 1918 influenza flu while you were in utero? And then if we trace you over time, as you kind of age into school and adulthood and retirement and so on, what kind of outcomes do you have and how do these compare to people who were not similarly impacted when they were in utero? And what we see are rather large reductions in human capital, even for these kids that were not directly falling ill themselves, but whose mothers were ill when they were pregnant with them. And so what we're seeing is that as these people grow up, they have lower educational attainment, lower wages and socioeconomic status, higher rates of poverty and incarceration, higher welfare payments, higher rates of physical disability and other health issues. And they also have worse marriage market prospects, perhaps because of these, economic and educational, insults that they've experienced earlier in their lives. Women in particular seem to suffer this biggest marriage market penalty. They marry earlier and to less well-educated spouses, which you might imagine to have an impact on their household finances and their ability to access schooling and, and medicine and things like that for their kids. which is perhaps what's leading us to this other finding of intergenerational harm. So among the children and grandchildren of people who were exposed in utero to the 1918 pandemic, we see lower educational status, lower occupational prestige, and lower family socioeconomic status. And of course, this could be due to epigenetic factors. It could be due to these marriage market effects or to the role of income and education, both for that individual and in the way that income and education are transmitted across generations, right? So, you can imagine that to the extent that, my wages and educational status have been adversely impacted, that adversely impacts my ability to provide for my children's access to these same health and economic inputs. Okay, so let's now think a little bit about the consequences through this economic channel. So the extent of economic disruption under COVID-19 is much greater than in other recent pandemics. Importantly, under COVID-19, neither mortality-related demographic change nor kind of losses in labor supply due to illness or mortality seem to be responsible for this COVID-19 recession. And likewise, in kind of reply to a common misconception, there's limited evidence actually that shutdowns or lockdowns are primarily responsible for the recession, which means that it's really going to be important to get the pandemic itself under control if we want to kind of start redressing or start kind of avoiding some of these adverse effects through the economic channel. And so what we're going to focus on are recessions of primarily economic origin, because we just don't really have a good analog to a pandemic-driven recession. So how do business cycles, booms and busts affect health in the short run? So the net effects of downturns on morbidity and mortality are ambiguous because there's a number of different factors, both positive and negative, that kind of work at cross purposes. And so which of these sets of effects dominates on net is going to depend on the particular of the context that we're studying. So for instance, the size and the nature and the origin of the economic shock, the baseline level of population health or income, the strength of social safety nets that allow people to kind of buffer and deal with these adverse shocks. So you might be wondering kind of what are some of the channels through which recessions might improve health? Well, to the extent that the modern workplace is a hazardous or otherwise stressful place, recessions tend to remove individuals from these potentially hazardous environments, and so your people tend to be less exposed to pollution, traffic accidents, on-the-job accidents, things like that. Particularly if their income is somewhat buttressed by social safety net type programs, the loss of income might be kind of offset by more time for breastfeeding, childcare, exercise, elder care, and other healthful activities in a recession. The loss of income also tends to limit the capacity for spending on unhealthy behaviors such as drinking, smoking, or illicit drugs. But perhaps much more intuitively, recessions might also harm health because for many people, the loss of income ends up compromising access to nutrition, high quality housing, medical care, and other things that are really crucial to our health status. And of course, job loss is an incredibly stressful event. And so people's psychological stress, rates of suicide, and rates of risky behavior might go up. Typically, we see on net, these effects of recessions tend to be positive, so i.e. beneficial in high-income countries. But the opposite, as you might imagine, is true in developing country or historical settings where baseline levels of income and health are lower to begin with, and where safety nets are weak, and so people are much more adversely affected by the loss of income. And in fact, many historical recessions concur with that finding. So in some recent work of mine on a 19th century recession in England, and then also in two other papers that look at the Great Depression more specifically, all of these are finding mixed to negative evidence of recessions on health. So recessions tend to worsen health, if anything. And I do want to point out this paper by Fishback et al., which shows that there would have been kind of a demographic catastrophe in terms of reduced fertility and higher mortality rates during the Great Depression had the New Deal relief spending not intervened. And so there is a really great example of timely and substantial policy action kind of averting this health crisis. In terms of the long run and scarring effects of recessions, these might be really important to think about in settings where most people survive an adverse shock only to have to contend with the kind of latent fallout. And some of those effects, as with that 1918 literature that I talked about earlier, stem from the immediate impact on household income, and in particular, how these adverse shocks to household income when you're in utero might affect your later life outcomes. And so in an earlier paper of mine and in this paper by Fishbeck and Thomason, both focused on the Dust Bowl and Depression era, they find that kind of adverse income shocks due to these events in utero or in early childhood tend to result in lower educational attainment, higher rates of disability, lower occupational outcomes, and so on. Other penalties that arise from the disruption to labor markets and human capital acquisition are really occurring not from this in utero period, but from the period of kind of important transition points in people's careers. And we tend to call this labor market scarring. So the idea here is, what are the effects on my later career of having graduated into a recession, say? And much of the evidence that we have here is taken from college graduates from the 2008 recession. And a lot of that evidence is mixed. Some of it suggests that those effects, those adverse effects on our kind of lifetime income and things like that are temporary. But some of them suggest that they might actually be cumulative and permanent. So kind of the choices that we make or the kind of adverse economic outcomes that we sustain from having, had to enter the labor market during a really bad period might end up kind of penalizing us over our entire careers. Why might this be? Well, for a lot of those same reasons that I showed you in that schematic, right? So it could be driven by a mismatch in your initial job placement. So it's a poor fit for your skills. And then it's hard to get kind of off of that trajectory. It could be because you were forced to accept lower initial wages because the labor market was much worse at the time that you were looking for a job. It could be because of reduced working times. Maybe you're lucky to get employed or remain employed, but your boss cuts your hours. It could be because of delays in finding employment. Again, because jobs are scarcer, you're unemployed for a longer period of time, and so on. There are also strategic responses that you might take to these shocks. If you're, graduating to recession, you might choose to migrate to a different labor market in search of opportunities there. You might choose to temporarily exit from the labor force. You say, this is too dispiriting. I'm not going to look anymore. I'm going to wait this one out. This is actually something we've seen a lot in COVID-19 with women who have withdrawn from the labor force at much higher rates than others. It might also affect your human capital acquisition. Maybe you decide to, rather than look for a job, I'll go to grad school or I'll, get some additional training that will put me in a better position to face this bad labor market. And those types of choices that we might make themselves have implications for short and long run labor market prospects that are kind of separate from those that arise initially from that shock itself. And then, finally, some recent work on the Great Depression also kind of offers this long run perspective, showing that there's a substantial earnings penalty among those that are less educated who are entering the labor market during the Great Depression. Some ongoing work with my co-authors shows that younger workers during the Great Depression tended to be crowded out of the best local jobs than older ones. So they were kind of squeezed out and faced the short run penalty that could either turn into a long run penalty or actually turn into potentially, kind of silver lining, depending on where they were living, because in some places this actually meant that they were being squeezed out of jobs that over the ensuing decades would actually become less economically important over, the kind of latter half of the 20th century in the US. And then finally, Feigenbaum shows that, intergenerational mobility fell for men during the Great Depression. And that those who were born to richer fathers tended to actually be able to at least kind of mitigate some of those adverse effects from mobility simply by having access to better destinations to which to migrate to weather the shock. So that kind of emphasizes, again, the capacity of these large adverse shocks to exacerbate rather than to equalize pre-existing inequalities. Now, I know that I am short on time, so I'm just going to kind of buzz through these last few slides. The demographics and distributional effects are going to be really important to us understanding how we can better target policy responses. And in particular, I want to highlight that the kind of evidence to date under COVID-19 has suggested that the pandemic has worsened pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities, in particular impacting women, minorities, low-income people, foreign-born people, and young workers who have experienced substantially worse both health and economic outcomes during this period. And that's something that we see quite a bit in historical pandemics as well, from the 1918 pandemic to the 19th century yellow fever outbreaks, to even pre-industrial plagues. And so kind of responding effectively to pandemics and dealing with their fallout is going to require us knowing and having a better idea of who's affected over time, over space, and within societies across groups. So I want to just wrap up by thinking a little bit about what sorts of things we might do today to help mitigate this long run damage. So the first and most important thing is to address the root cause. The best way to avoid or to kind of lessen the potential for these long run outcomes is to ensure that that inciting event of getting infected or being exposed to recession doesn't happen, right? And so getting the pandemic under control, both domestically and globally, for instance, through mass vaccination, is going to be essential to successfully reopening economically and to kind of removing these recessionary conditions. It's going to reduce the number of infections from which these health and economic harms ultimately follow. And it's also going to lower the probability of mutations that prolong and worsen the pandemic. So these are actually going to be important things to kind of staving off some of these adverse knock-on effects. Secondly, I think we want to take actions to identify and redress damage that is already sort of nascent. So we want to monitor and account for non-mortality harms. So not just mortality, but focus on people who maybe have had pandemic-induced disability or reductions in their quality of life or become unemployed or so on, and pay attention to those groups that are facing the greatest burdens of these less visible and less salient harms. For instance, young people who not only, may be kind of less visible the ways in which they've been hurt, but also who have like a longer time span over which to collect and accumulate these adverse effects. We want to target assistance to those who are most affected and most vulnerable. And then we want to invest kind of preemptively and aggressively rather than waiting for these costs to snowball. And this is because interventions, as I said, are most effective the closer they arrive to the original insult. So we end up saving ourselves a lot of growth and economic suffering and human suffering the more we invest in these issues now, and it might kind of be untenably expensive or maybe even impossible to redress if we wait 30 or 40 years for these to become really intractable and very costly problems. And then finally, we want to create the conditions for resilience. So I think that we don't want to become complacent or kind of set aside once we're over this particular hump. The actions that we need to take to prevent this sort of issue from happening again in the future, because these sort of once in a lifetime pandemics seem to only be becoming more frequent and in some cases worse. And so investing in disease surveillance, public health and medical infrastructure, institutions, procedures, and protocols that can help us better manage the next such crisis. And so potentially minimize or even completely avoid both the short and long-term harms is going to be really critical to managing the human and the economic costs of pandemics. And then finally, to the extent that we've seen that inequality really circumscribed people's experience of both the recession and the pandemic as a health crisis, improving baseline socioeconomic conditions will really go a long way to mitigating the cost of this pandemic and of future pandemics. So our priorities should really be reducing poverty, reducing inequality, and improving affordable access to healthcare, because it'll mean that, people are less likely to be vulnerable to, and they're more likely to be resilient to shocks like this, and they'll be more able to remediate them as well. This is, I want to emphasize, not just important for its own sake as an equity consideration, but also because the existence of these inequalities ultimately adversely impact all of our health and living standards. And so with that, I will just say thank you, and I'd love to hear any questions that folks might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Arthy, for that fantastic talk today. And so I'm just going to go ahead and give Brooke a moment here to go ahead and stop our recording.